Good afternoon, everybody. I'm overwhelmed. There's 43. Let's see, 43 participants here so far. I'm going to keep trying to admit. Welcome to the first of our 10 virtual Directors Academy sessions. Wow, just going to keep admitting here. Welcome, 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 everybody. My name is Dan Belangia. If we haven't met, I'm Director of Bands at Arkansas Tech, and happy to be here with you, although unhappy that we're having to do everything virtually here. A bit of an orientation for how we're going to get through all the Zoom. I'm quite sure most of you, if not everybody in here, is probably far better at Zoom than I am. So forgive me and correct me if I get something wrong, frankly, but I think we have this set up that everybody is muted from the start. That's helpful so that we all don't get the sound of each other's dogs barking in the background, etc. We have a way to raise your hand. If you do the, what's this? It's not the speaker view, it's the other gallery view up in the upper right hand corner, or speaker view down in the bottom. Let's see, where is the participants? Right there, it says 47 of us here. If you click on participants, you should find a way to raise your hand. It'll be over here in the chat. Now, in case you hear the whispering, the expert in Zoom here is Mrs. Belangia, that's in the corner, and she's been running yoga trainings across the country for the last few weeks. And so she's going to help us make sure we get off on the right foot here. And when you'd like to chime in, and in particular, I know Dr. Daughters and Dr. Perry are hoping you will participate in the sessions. The raise hand function that's over in the chat on the side of the screen can help do that. And if it's failing, you know, never fear, one of these can work, or turn your mute off and chime in.
Darren's got it.
Yep, there, Darren, we see your raised hand there. Thank you. Hey, Tyler. Hey, Colby. Hey, Jessica. Look at all these people. Hey, Melissa. There's Colby Lawyer. Let's see. We got all kinds of people here. Let's see. So the next order of business, we have chats on the right-hand side. Let's see, Devin is posting, and I see people got Julia's email. So that's my next order of business, is if you are an Arkansas teacher and you would like some professional development hours, the way to do this is pop into the chat over there. And as so many of our colleagues have already done, you type your name, where you teach, and your email address, and the letters PD. And that'll help Julia wrangle the certificates and get professional development for those of you that are seeking it.
James has his hand up.
James has his hand up. So let's see. Let's unmute James. Hi, James. Oops.
Sometimes the unmute doesn't work, so they might have to unmute themselves.
James, can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
There it is. Hi, James.
I was just going to say hi.
Hi. Julia, anything that I missed or needs clarification? Julia's got to unmute herself.
Yeah, it's not going to work unless she does it.
I think we need you to unmute yourself, Julia.
Okay,
There she is.
there I am. No, they just jumped in there doing it correctly with their name, school, email, and then PD, so we can sort through those pretty quickly to see who needs a certificate.
Right. And if anybody is here from outside of the state of Arkansas, if we can help you with professional development in your home state, let us know. We'll be happy to provide some kind of documentation that you were here and participated, although obviously that's not If you're from out of state, Julia is the executive director of the ASBOA, Arkansas School Band and Orchestra Association. So she's processing that for our directors in the Arkansas Department of Education. But if you're from another state and you would like some assistance with that, we're happy to help. So let's see, 6-7 minutes. That's too long of orientation, etc. The important stuff here is our first presentation is about the practice and preparation of marches. Most of us that I'm seeing here know my colleague, Dr. Daughters, and know that he has dedicated a large part of his professional life to becoming an expert on this exact topic. So Dr. Daughters, thanks for agreeing to be here and be our first presenter on marches, and it is all yours, my friend.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So I want to give a little background on my relationship with the march and why that's a research interest of mine. So through high school and college, I played exactly one march, and it was in college wind ensemble, and it was the Stars and Stripes Forever. And I don't even remember what we played it for. But as I grew and as a band director, and in my state, we were required to play marches at assessment. And I really didn't do them justice because I just didn't know how to interpret them. We all get CDs in the mail, or, well, I'm showing my age. We used to get CDs in the mail of service bands. And it would be all kinds of different interpretations. Some would play them straight through with what was exactly on the page without any interpretation at all. Others would be incredibly different from what was on the page. So as a young band director, I just had no idea what I was supposed to do with these things. I was never taught in methods in college. I wasn't taught in high school. I wasn't taught, by my college band directors. So I just had to tackle it on my own. So when I became conductor of the Fillmore Wind Band, it obviously, we play a lot of Fillmore marches, and it was not lost on me that here we are doing Fillmore marches, and I had no idea how to interpret. Now, I know in Arkansas, high school bands, when we go to assessment, we're required to play a march. And actually, the music committee met at the All-State Conference and talked about what marches were and why they're important, and tried to really talk about defining and cleaning up some of these things. So my purpose today is really coming at the perspective that I had no clue what to do. And so this is sort of a really simple toolkit for you to get started, for you to tackle. And I will tell you too, I think Dr. Belanger is probably tired of me talking about marches and doing marches, but I love them because they're just, it brings out a lot of creativity. It's one of the few pieces of music, types of music that we have that we can just be super creative with. So without further ado, I'm going to go through my notes, and please, I've done this presentation at Midwest and several state conferences, and I like doing it in person because I usually have a band behind me and we can demonstrate what the score sounds like and then what it sounds like when we manipulate and interpret. So I like that interaction. That being said, if you have a question along the way, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask. Otherwise, I'll be talking for a little while, and then we have a couple videos at the end that shows one of Fillmore marches without much interpretation, and then one that we've done with the Fillmore Wind Band, the same march that you can listen to. Before we start though, sorry, Dr. B, I have to do a quick little interlude. We have handouts of our clinics up on our ATU bands page. So Dr. Perry, who's going after me, and myself, we have handouts. So if you want to get on your computer, and I'll give you a few seconds to do this, it's atu.edu/bands. And again, it's atu.edu/bands. And then if you scroll down, you'll see a heading that says Concert, Athletic, and Jazz. And right under that, it's going to say Resources. And click on Resources for Educators. So I'll go through that one more time real quick. atu.edu/bands. Scroll down to Concert, Athletic, Jazz. It's literally the first set of words on the page. Go to Resources, and then click on Resources for Educators. And there you're going to see Virtual Directors Academy resources, and click on that. And that will bring up my handout for this, which includes 2 different scores of a march, and the clinic handout, and then Dr. Perry's will be on there as well. Okay, so let's get back to this. So when I really started, my dissertation was about marches. It's 250 pages of my life that I'll never get back, but it was 3 years of research and 1 year of writing. And so my research really took all of the March resources that we have, which a lot of is in the archives at the University of Illinois, and really just combined it all into one living working document. So when I started writing, when I asked band directors what they wanted to know about marches, 4 themes kept popping up. One is, what was I supposed to change? Okay, so I have this piece of music, what am I supposed to do to it? The second is, we get a lot of service band recordings with no changes whatsoever, and they want to know why. Third, what is march style? That's something that I struggle with a lot. How am I supposed to stylize marches? And last, and this is one I struggled with as a teacher, if I change something in a march, what are adjudicators going to say about it at assessment? And I get adjudicators that are very happy with changes, and some that don't understand that you can change a march. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Why do we perform marches? And this is one of the questions, you know, when we perform marches at assessment, we always come across this question, well, why? Why do we have to keep doing this? Why can't we just do 2 or 3 pieces and not include a march? Well, marches represent quality music and excellent compositions by quality composers. Some of the greatest composers of our time wrote marches. Beethoven, Mozart, and on wrote marches. Audiences love hearing them. Students, except for maybe the French horn section, love performing them. The audience loved them. I mean, I can sit and listen to the Marine Band play a really amazing march, and it just gets your blood going. It's awesome. Great marches come from all over the planet, from so many different countries and different continents. So whether it be Asian or Turkish or American, British, whatever, French, Italian, there are so many different types of marches, and it represents just a great array of music that we have. They are significant in our history. They are our heritage, historically significant. They are always demanding of the most musical skills and sensitivity that musicians and conductors can provide during rehearsals. I've always thought, if I can teach a march, I can teach any type of music. March, the style, the interpretation, the musicality, if I can teach a march well, I can teach anything that I put in front of my kids. So march defined. I know there was some conversation at the Allstate Clinic on, okay, what is a march? What can we include as a march? A really loose definition: music with a strong repetitive pattern or rhythm in an uncomplicated style. Essentially, an ornamentation of a fixed, regular, and repeated drum rhythm with regularly occurring accents. That's the most comprehensive music dictionary definition of a march that there is. Now, there's all kinds of different ways that we can go here. The history of the march, one of the first times it was ever mentioned was in Virgil's Aeneid, when instruments were acknowledged as using for advancing armies. And then we go through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. Beethoven had a ton of marches. Sometimes they were functional, meaning they were used for a purpose, used to move a group down a street. Sometimes they weren't. And then we get to the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, with John Philip Sousa, and we're using things like the Washington Post, not only as a functional march, but also as a dance. People would dance to the Washington Post. So with that being said, I'm going to screen share here for just a second. Hold on, let me make sure I pull up the right thing. All right. Dr. B, can you see that I just pulled up okay? All right, good.
Yes.
Great. So this at the top, to start my research, it really is okay, what type of marches are there, and where does it come from? So if you look at the types of military marching in the upper left-hand corner, I've got the type of march and the tempo marking. So, you know, a funeral march, for example, used to accompany the deceased to a cemetery, provide appropriate music at funerals and memorial services. Functional meaning it can be used to move people, physically move people, or to set a mood, and that's traditionally much slower at metronome marking of 72. A slow march or an ordinary march is again, we don't play these very much. There's not a lot of this in our repertoire. There's some, but the standard by which tempos of other marches are measured. This was used for exercises, reviews, and parades. So a metronome marking of 60 to 80. I remember watching the Marine Band in their barracks in Washington, D.C., and they do a lot of slower ordinary marches. Any of you that have ever been and watched them do their formations on the field with the rifles and stuff, they're using slow and ordinary marches for that. It's really cool if you've not ever seen it. A quick march, that's where we really land with all of our marches now. Twice as fast as a slow march, metronome marking, usually between 100 and 140, with 116 to 120 being the norm. This type of march is also used for maneuvering too, so you'll see a lot of parade bands doing a quick march and a parade route. A double quick march we call an attack march, and it's still more rapid in tempo, so you can get, you know, upwards of 140, 150, 160. And again, this is military marching, okay? So when we get to march music types, the next chunk below, military marches, you know, I've put between 112 and 144, but remember the norm is 116 to 120 as far as the metronome marking. Circus marches, which I love and are near and dear to me, they reflect the pageantry of the circus, which most of Fillmore and Carl King's marches are circus marches. And it's important to know if you're playing a circus march or a traditional military march, because the tempo is going to be much different and it's going to give the march a much different feel. Rhythmic drive is given to the percussion parts, and precision is essential. Circus marches are often punctuated by unwritten accents. The range and tempo depends on the nature of the circus activity. So it depended on if there were trapeze or elephants or whatever on how fast it went. And they're usually between 140 and 170. Henry Fillmore, for example, right before he died, said most of his marches he loves playing at 160, which is faster than most of us have ever taken them. So like His Honor and Americans We, things like that, you don't play those at 120. They're not military marches, they're circus marches, and they're just meant to be much faster. Funeral marches, which we talked about, I skipped gallops. I think gallops is defined simply as a march played fast. And there are a lot of classically written gallops that we hear. And then patrols, I want to encourage you, if you've never done a patrol before, patrols are really interesting. They're intended to simulate the sound of a band marching past a listener. So a patrol, for example, will start really soft up off in the distance. And as you get towards the middle of the march, it gets louder as though it's passing you in front of the grandstand. And then it fades out to nothing. And patrols are really cool. So it's a gradual crescendo and then a gradual decrescendo. So if you've not done a patrol, there's just so many cool things that you can do with it. And some of the patrols too, it's just one strain of the march is in a patrol rather than the entire march. European marches are unique in differences in style and tempo, and I'm not gonna dive down that rabbit hole right now, but you can see on what I've shared, British, German, Paso Doble, Italian, and French. Most of them are slightly slower than what we take American marches. British marches traditionally around 108. So that's something to keep in mind too when you're working on marches. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, get back to the pretty butterfly above my head. And then, okay, so what is march style? And again, if you have a question, because I'm not paying attention if any hands are raised, Dr. B, if you'll help me out on that, if anyone has a question. So the heart of a march, I saw a great presentation, I think it was around 2012, 2013 at Midwest by John Whitwell, who it was either still at Michigan State or had just retired. I think he had just retired. He did a great presentation on march style. And I used his presentation as a point to jump off of how to really teach stylistically correct from march. So one of the things that he uses the term is the heart of a march. He calls the tuba and double bass, bass drum, horns, and percussion. These parts, and I'll say that again, tuba, a string bass if you're using a string bass drum, horns, and the rest of the percussion, typically snare and cymbals, they account for 2/3 of the basic march elements, and they have to be a priority. When I walk into band rooms over the years and work on marches, I will tell you the part of the march that is ignored the most are these sections. The bass line, you know, we usually rehearse a couple measures, and if they have it, they have it. French horns, teaching upbeats, particularly to young kids, I'm guilty of it too. There's a lot of times that I'll wave the white flag and say, okay, horns, do your best. But you can't ignore it, and they are so, so important. A lot of people don't pay attention to the horns. And again, the horns usually, if you say a march to the horns, you get this, just kind of, we still get that in the Fillmore band is they, it's just that built-in mentality of they're playing upbeats all the time, but they're so incredibly important. So that's what I rehearse first. I make sure that those elements are rock solid. And stylistically, that sets up the dance feel for the rest of the march. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a second. Stylistically, an appropriate marcato is important. Detached style. Harry Begian, who was the director of bands at the University of Illinois for a very long time, and who I kind of see as the march guru, he always said whenever he did march presentations, he did 5 or 6 march presentations at Midwest, and he always used this quote for a march: release each note before articulating the next. And that's incredibly important with a march. It is a detached style, and it must have space. Pay really close attention to the accents and dynamics. This is what makes a march dance. And pay a great attention to detail and performance of the march, or perform the march with elegance. One of the most important things that I've talked about, and as I've traveled around Arkansas and worked on marches, first thing I really go for is what we call the lilt of the march. And the lilt of the march really brings the march to life and makes it dance. And quite literally, it's just lilting of the downbeat versus beat 2. The old saying, friends don't let friends clap on 1 and 3. Well, in a march, you want the strong beats to be beat 1. You want that to be the principal beat. Beat 2 is much, much less in volume and a little less light. So you get this 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, this kind of pulsating sound in a march. You'll hear the Marine Band do it. You'll hear really good bands that play marches, and it completely transforms how a march sounds. So the second beat of the bass line, so we're talking the bass drum and the bass line, tubas, bass clarinets, Sperry sax, whoever else. The second beat of the bass line has to be softer than beat 1. So strong, weak, strong, weak. Beat 2 serves as the rebound beat. So keep that in mind, even if you're conducting, strong, weak, strong, weak. Okay, same thing. The music sings or dances. This dances and supports the march and having a dance feel. This lilt is so incredibly important. Sousa's Washington Post, and I'm bringing up the Washington Post again, was a 2-step, which was one of the most popular dances in the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. A foxtrot can even be considered a march, and it's this lilt that gives it that light dance feel. So a few more things with march style. You want to balance the heart, and remember we said the heart was the tuba, the bass drum, horns, percussion. You have to balance that with the melody, the counter melody, and the obligato. Don't let the heart just kind of fade out. It's that foundation. It has to be solid the whole time.
Dr. Daughters.
Yes, sir, go.
I think it'd be good. Would you take a moment and reiterate that heart again?
Yeah.
You said that it was tuba, the string bass,
bass drum, French horns, and anyone else that might be playing the upbeats, depending on if you're playing an addition or arrangement, it could be altos, for example, and the rest of the percussion section. And again, that's 2/3 of the march is that heart.
So we're talking about oompas.
Right, exactly. And when I watched that John Whitwell clinic, he spent actually about 2/3 of the clinic talking about the heart and demonstrating how to do that correctly. I just can't emphasize enough. We can all, shape a melody and make the melody sound great and the counter melody. That's not going to be the issue. The issue is always that heart.
I saw Mr. Whitwell make that same presentation, and he was my teacher, and I saw Dr. Fennell work really hard on that weak 2 and 4, strong 1 and 3.
Yeah.
Do you feel 60%, 40%, 65, 35? What's the relationship between those heavy and weak beats?
Yeah, to me, it depends on the speed of the march. Typically, if we're going faster, like a circus march, we'll probably do 65-35, maybe 70-30, even just to get it to move quicker.
That's it, right? It has to feel like a wheel, right? It has to feel like forward motion.
Right. So if you listen to a traditional Sousa march, you're going to get some lilt, but maybe, 55, 45, maybe it's going to be there, but it's not going to be as prominent as if you're doing a fast circus march or a gallop. Okay. So yeah, really important. Which brings me to tempo. Choose a tempo appropriate for the style of march you are performing. And if you go back to that guide that I had before, you have to know what type of march you're performing and perform it at an appropriate tempo. An example, Henry Fillmore usually wrote in phrases twice as long as Sousa. And Fillmore also knew that his marches were going to go a lot faster. And if you take the Fillmore march that's supposed to be a circus march much slower, it becomes labored in the phrasing because they're just struggling to play these long phrases. Fillmore a lot of times writes in 16-bar phrases, which he wants in one breath, but that means the march is cooking. And that's really important that you have to remember. Tempo is everything with the march. Rhythm. The one thing I'll say that I think one of the most important things I learned about rhythm, and I taught this incorrectly for about 15 years until I figured out, oh, that's not how I'm supposed to be doing that. Accent shapes in a march. If it's a half note or longer in a march, accent shaped notes get full value. So, as I teach an accent with big front, decay, and separation, in a march, there's big front. If it's a half note or longer, there's big front, but there is no decay. That's really, really important. If you go back and listen to the marches of William Ravelli or Harry Bejan, you're going to hear all of those longer notes, half notes, dotted halves, whole notes. They are full value. They are articulated when you get to the next long note. I always taught it with a lot of decay, like a typical accent would be, but that's not the case. And once I started doing that, teaching that correctly, it changed the feel of everything. And that's really, really important. I just didn't know any better until I got there. Dynamics, the only thing I'm going to say about dynamics is you all know by listening to bands on the stage, percussion section tends to be way too loud in dynamics. Make sure that the percussion section's balanced with the melody, counter melody, obligato. And then the last thing before we move on here is that musicality. Remember, a lot of marches are written to showcase the virtuosity of the players in the band. So Sousa, he knew he was writing for, he knew who the standout amazing musicians were. And he wrote parts to really showcase those musicians. So if you have a hotshot clarinet player or an amazing clarinet section, don't be afraid to thin things out and showcase them. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's what part of the march is for, showcase the virtuosity of your players. So if you're following along with the handout, the next part, and I'm going to start going a little bit faster, the next part is before we can interpret which edition should we play. So this was really confusing for me too, is there's a lot of editions. I'll take his honor since we're going to listen to that in a few minutes. So his honor, there are 5 or 6 editions, and I'll just use J.W. Pepper for example. The best-selling edition is the Fred Fennell edition. The Robert Foster edition also gets a lot of buys. I will tell you, if you want the original, and this is kind of interesting to me, if you want the original print march with just the name Henry Fillmore, no arranged or no edition, you have to go to the marching band section of J.W. Pepper. They sell it under the marching band music. And it's typically, like his honor, I think I looked it up, it's like $40 or $45, where if you bought the Fennell edition, especially if you're on a budget, the Fennell edition of that march will be closer to 100. So that's something that's kind of interesting on what they've done. But we still have the original editions that you can buy. It's just under marching band on J.W. Pepper, and I'll just use that as a distributor, for example. So things to consider about an edition, and I'll kind of hit these sort of fast. So if you buy the original, it's going to be in that flip folder, lyre size, that a lot of times the ink, it's still in the original print and it hasn't been put on finale or Sibelius or anything like that. And a lot of time there's smudges together. There's no rehearsal numbers or letters, so kids will have to know what first strain, introduction, trio, those things are. They always come with reduced scores, so it's just like a piano part. They include things like D-flat piccolo, horns in different keys, so you have to keep that in mind. All drum parts are on the same page. Now, the one thing I'll say about drum parts with Sousa and Fillmore, they had no idea what they wanted their percussion parts to sound like. And actually, Henry Fillmore, one of the reasons he never put markings in his music, he said he never knew what he wanted a march to sound like until he got in front of the band. And that's something to remember. He would put the notes on the page and make sure everyone had notes and rhythms, but there were no dynamic markings, style markings. Percussion parts were just sort of cut and paste, and those guys would make stuff up. And, you know, if Henry wanted an accent somewhere, he'd add it in rehearsal. And of course, as you all know, if you change something in rehearsal, very rarely does it go back and get added to the original printed music. So when you're getting this stuff, if you play an original, you're not going to have any of those markings. It's all up to you. Now, that being said, when we get to Fennell, he did the first edition of this. And one of the reasons for a lot of the Fennell editions is he was changing the instrumentation to match the East Wind Ensemble. And so when he was adding timpani and sort of modernized parts, he added a contra-alto and a contrabass clarinet part. He added the timpani, separated the percussion parts. He was really doing these additions for the East Wind Ensemble. So he's very close to the original. He doesn't add many of his own interpretive elements that he adds to the music. He was just really writing it out so the East Wind Ensemble could play it with their extended instrumentation. If you really, for a lot of these marches, if you want a march with interpretation, so in other words, they've done the work for you, Robert Foster's editions usually have all those. It's his interpretation. He splits the percussion parts. He eliminates certain instruments from certain strains just so you get strains and variation. So why an edition over an original? The interpretive suggestions are important, especially if you've not done a march before. The parts are full page. They have rehearsal numbers or letters, added percussion parts. So, you know, my bands, especially at middle school, there was always umpteen percussionists, and that's the one downside about a march. One of the things I don't like about doing a march with an honor band is you have, you know, 8 to 10 percussionists, and there's a lot of times only 3 or 4 percussion parts. So the Foster edition adds percussion parts, which will help. And then 2 parts on the same page, a lot of times he just separates them out. So like the first horn will be on its own page, the second horn will be on its own page. And it's just easier to read that way.
And Jim, so like with all things, you know, the source is important. So you mentioned Bob Foster settings are going to be pretty researched and pretty accurate. Yes, I believe he did a lot of work or might have even had some conversations with these people, and certainly people that played under the composer's batons.
Yeah.
Fennell.
Go ahead.
Foster, Fennell. I imagine Brian's going to come up.
Yeah.
Any others? To my mind, those are the big 3.
Loris Schissel is the other one.
Of course.
And Schissel and Bob Foster are probably the 2 best researched marches. I talked to Bob Foster when I was working on my dissertation, and they both really dug in, just sort of like I did with march research on what was appropriate performance practices and that sort of thing. A lot of my interpretive suggestions comes from, you know, primary source recordings, like listening to Fillmore conduct honor bands and conduct the Fillmore band and the original Sousa band recordings that you can find in archives, and just listen to what they did versus what was on the music. So Bob Foster and Loris Schissel and Keith Bryan all, you know, and even with the new Marine Band editions of all the Sousa marches, they are incredibly well researched. And I would call them performance editions. I mean, it's as Sousa would have done it.
Now, I'm imagining here, though, for many of us, those settings, if they're beyond the capability of my players, where do I go next? Because those are hard. Those
absolutely. So there's some tricks that you can do, and I'll get to this in a minute on what you can change. With my 8th grade middle school group, you know, we would play, you know, grade 3 and 4 marches, but a lot of times those marches, the originals, the clarinet part, for example, is just sky high, and there's no way that you can get middle school clarinets to sound good in that register. So a lot of times, even just taking the clarinet part down an octave will completely fix how you can approach a march with younger kids. And a lot of times that grade level is higher because of range. And if you just fix the range, it makes a big difference. But I'll talk about that again in just a second on, you know, a lot of these marches are out of reach because there are some, you know, I certainly wouldn't do Circus Bee with you know, a band that was not capable of doing grade 5 or grade 6. So we'll talk about that more in just a second. So that brings me to the next thing, interpretation. March manuscripts rarely contain interpretations of the composer, which we just talked about. Composers often assume that bandmasters, and by composers, I'm, you know, Sousa, Fillmore, and those types. They assume that band directors knew march style, so they didn't bother with stylistic marking. So everyone was, you know, playing marches, everyone knew march style. But of course, over the years, I was never taught march style, so it's something of a lost art that's been lost over the years. Most of the composers, Sousa, King, Fillmore, they rehearsed their own marches, so that, you know, they made it sound like they wanted it to sound. There's in no way, there's not a specific way to play a march. So for example, there's not a textbook way to play King Cotton, for example. Every interpretation is different. John Philip Sousa said that if you ever heard his band twice and they played the same march, he wanted it to sound different if you heard it a second time. So if you were a Sousa groupie following the Sousa band, and, you know, they played the same march 3 nights in a row, he wanted it to sound different. He was purposely changing things. So there's not a textbook way. The only thing that's important is that you play a convincing interpretation of the march. So the other thing I'm going to talk about before I talk about what you can change, Harry Begian at the Midwest Clinic in '99, there's a few bullet points that I want to say. He said there isn't a true version of any march. I agree 100%. Symphony orchestra conductors don't copy. So in other words, Muti versus Yarvi's version of Beethoven 5 are going to be different depending on their background, nationality, and everything else. And a march is, you know, a march is the same way. Come up with your own version. Come up with your own convictions. Great band directors, their marches reflect their own musical tastes. Come up with an interpretation that is convincing to you, the players, and the audience. He also finished, that is the true test of the quality of conductor, not how well he can copy a conductor's interpretation, but how well he can interpret for himself. I'm going to say that one more time because I think that's a great statement. The true test of the quality of the conductor is not how well he can copy another conductor's interpretation, but how well he can interpret. Okay, so in short, interpret the march. Don't blindly accept someone else's addition. That being said, that's a good place to start. That's how I started. I copied so I could learn how to do it. And then over the years, I figured out, okay, I can do this and this. And I kind of put my own spin on marches. So that leads me to the next.
I think it's a good idea, Jim, at this point to maybe draw one of those lines here in regard to the march for the joy and the art of playing a march, as well as that dual responsibility of that march that's required of assessment.
Yeah, go into that a little bit more so I know what your line of thinking is on that.
Well, I'm only speculating that some of the folks listening might be kind of thinking, I think you touched on it a little earlier. Well, what does an adjudicator make of this? If
Right.
I took the clarinet part down the octave, if I'm interpreting because I read a quote about how the test of a conductor is his interpretation, and I get 3 turtlenecks in the back row and they kill me. How do I explain that to the band parents and the kids and the principal?
Right, and that's a great segue question into what I'm going to talk about next. But, you know, when I went to Lake Hamilton this spring, John was working on the Melody Shop. And so when I went down, you know, I have my way of doing the Melody Shop, which is completely different. I think Andrew Glover did the edition of it. And it's completely different than what the original or the edition is. And John was scared to death. You know, I changed everything. I moved strains around, just did all sorts of stuff. And John was scared to death to take that march to assessment. He's like, Jim, they're going to kill me. Like, nothing on the page is what we're playing. And I understand. And, you know, that's something that we all struggle with, which is another reason we do these clinics. So hopefully we keep educating on what you can and can't do to a march. But the one thing that I told John to do was just to put a disclaimer at the beginning, we're going to play this march as historically accurate as possible, which includes, and then the changes that we made. And that's where we started. And again, Dr. B, like you said, sometimes you'll get the turtlenecks. I've gotten them at assessment. Why'd you change this? You're not supposed to change this. That's not what the music says. Well, and every March clinic that I've ever done, I always get that question. But again, the more and more that we do these March clinics and what you're supposed to do, the better off we're going to be and the more informed everyone is on what good March practice is. So that takes me to the next thing. What can you change in a March? So these are the, I'm going to call them the quote unquote rules of what you can change in a March. You can change the dynamics in entire strains or parts of strains in addition to changing registers. So I'm going to say that again. You can change dynamics in entire strains, so like first strain, second strain trio, or parts of the strains in addition to changing registers. For example, you can take instruments down an octave at the trio, for example. Okay, so that's one thing you can change. You can add accents to agree with your own aural perception of how you want it to be played. A lot of times I'll put in accents where none are written at the end of a phrase or at the top, at the highest note of a phrase, for example. You can alter percussion parts if necessary. Keep in mind, most composers weren't percussionists. The one rule that I will say, most March composers hated a roll-off at the end of their March. Fillmore hated it. Sousa wasn't fond of it. I did it for a long time, the bump, 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 bump. At the end, and then I read a lot of stuff that said they hated it. I was like, oh crap, I can't do that anymore. So keep that in mind. Flutes, for example, can transition to piccolo at different parts of the march if you want. Bells can be added for accentuation on the melody. Add or delete voices to change colors and bring out unique textures. Again, showcase the strengths of your band. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm going to make this statement. Brass players should rest more often in marches. The brass don't have to play the whole time. Showcase those colors of the band, those extended instruments. Include a separate pair of symbols to accentuate special accents and music. Have students memorize like the last strain and have the brass stand up at the end. We always use, in the Fillmore band, we use a field drum rather than a snare drum. It just gives it a more historically accurate performance, and it makes the sound a little different too. And again, always show off the virtuosity of the players. What I'm going to say next, what you can't change, always maintain the march style. Okay, you have to maintain the march style. Don't change the march style. Legato playing, if opportunistic, can be used in the trio section. And more often than not, the trio section is going to be a change in style, and you definitely want to accentuate that. Don't play the entire march in a legato or tenuto style. It's always detached. Maintain a steady tempo throughout. Now, I know a lot of us like that the spot in Stars and Stripes Forever, a lot of conductors will slow that dee 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 bum bum bum, and they go back to tempo. Typically, Sousa and Fillmore didn't do that, but I'm a believer in not changing the tempo and just keep going right through. Remain true to the melodic, harmonic, and rhythm aspects of the march. So in other words, don't change the rhythms. Water if you need to. Don't change the melody. Don't change the harmony because you think it's predictable or something else. Those are the things that you cannot change. Okay, so we're going to finish up. There's two recordings I'm going to play for you, which I think are really interesting. The first is Henry Fillmore's His Honor, and it's with very little interpretation at all. Now, if you have the handout, if you downloaded it and you go through my notes, I've put the original score to His Honor on there. I think it's 4 pages and it's condensed so you can see what the original looks like.
Yeah, some people have joined in since the beginning. In the chat, there are links to atu.edu/bands and educator resources. You can click on the Virtual Academy, and Dr. Perry and Dr. Daughter's PDFs are there for everybody if you want to jump over to Google.
Absolutely. So if you want to follow along with the score, even if not, just listen to it. So remember, there's going to be an introduction. There's a first strain that's repeated. There's a second strain that's repeated. There's a trio. And then there's the dogfight section. And then there's the final strain. And those 2 sections are repeated. When this group does the repeat, see if you can hear any change. There's one small change that they do in the march at some place, but I want you to sort of figure that out. And then we'll talk about different interpretation of it. So let me make sure. So YouTube should be popping up on your screen, and I'm going to hit play. In just a second. All right, so I don't know about you. If that were my band, I'd be completely happy with that. That's a great recording of that march. I'm gonna share a screen here, and I'm gonna show you really quick because I'm gonna play for you our recording of the march. If you look at His Honor interpretive adjustments, so the things that I've changed in this march, we do the introduction in the first strain as written. I will say Henry Fillmore liked, and I have recordings of Fillmore with honor bands taking this march above 160, and he just flew through it. He'd also like to yell in the middle of it to just get kids to go faster during the performance. But we take this around 152 with the Fillmore band. So the introduction and first strain are the same, or as written. The second strain, the first time, we bring the brass out to fortissimo, and the woodwinds, we tacit. So it's just brass the first time. The second time, woodwinds, fortissimo, brass and percussion, pianissimo. So we just get a different stylistic or interpretive feel. So the trio, here's where we start mixing things up. Percussion in the trumpet section are tacit. Single trumpet staying on a concert F with a cut mute at measures 43, 51, 59, and 67, just to add a little sparkle to the top of the line. And we also do that with the crash cymbals. Now, one of the things that we do that Fillmore did is we repeat the trio. And if you look at where it says trio second time, it's written out. So I have the score for, by the way, the score of the performance edition after that, if you keep going through in the handout. So the trio, the second time, we write it out. We add the double tonguing trumpets that you hear from the final strain, and the repeat of the trio. We also have the snare drum, doubling that part, the double tonguing trumpet parts. We either do it on a rim or on a wood block. And then we layer percussion and other voices in slowly, so we keep building towards the dog fight or the break strain. The break strain we perform as written. The final strain, the first time, the melody and harmony is piano. Some tacit melody and harmony are legato style, woodwind obligatos fortissimo, and then the final time, as written and played in a detached style. So we vary the style on that final strain. The other thing I'll say too is that the stinger, there's a lot of people make too much of a concerto out of the stinger. It's in the same style as the rest of the march. So don't turn it into, this 3-second note with all this resonance at the end. It's just a stinger right at the end of the march. Okay, so I'm going to play for you the Fillmore Band recording of His Honor, and you're going to hear it go faster, and you're going to hear those changes that I just talked about. So let me pull that up on YouTube, and hopefully that's popping up on your screen. All right. So that brings me to the end. On the handout, if you go to the very last page, there's a selected march list that I've compiled all types of British and Italian and European and American marches that if you're interested in sort of exploring just the array of different types of marches, buy one of them or just hunt through libraries, and hopefully all that information will help you. Dr. B, that wraps me up. If we have any questions before Dr. Perry starts, or if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I had two thoughts. I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware. You're being a bit humble. This setting with those changes in it, Dr. Daughters has that setting available. He's been kind enough to share it with me. I think, Jim, I did it with the Kentucky All-State, and I did it with the Russellville Region Band, and I did it here with the Symphony Band at Tech. It's fantastic. The changes provide clarity. I thought of two quotes, I suppose, while I was listening here too. If with our new virtual world, I'm sure, like everybody else, I've been spending more time on the computer, and I'm again sure I'm very late to the game. And most of you maybe have been long aware of Rick Beato and Everything Music. If not, his name is spelled like Beato, Beato. Look him up. He's got an amazing YouTube channel, Everything Music, Rick Beato. And one of the fun series is What Makes This Song Great? And it's pop songs, and it's rock songs, and it's all kinds of stuff. And there's one on Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, that is unbelievable. And I've launched into a bunch of them now. And one of his tropes that he comes back to when he's at a point, what makes the song great? He says they repeat the chorus here. And sometimes he'll say, you know why? Because it's cool. And I think too often we get away from that kind of thing. And a march is a perfect time to remember that. If you're wondering with your group whether a change is the right idea or not, if it sounds great, maybe it's the right idea. If it doesn't sound great, it's not the right idea. I suppose and then the other quote was, I had a chance to hear Keith Bryan talk about Sousa marches. And most of you know him and how he even impersonates Sousa now. He travels the country. And he said something I'd never considered before. He said that Sousa believed that his marches were tiny symphonies in the truest sense of the word, in lockstep with sonata allegro form. And I'd never thought about it before. I wonder if some of us have. They have introductions, they have an A theme, they have a B theme. Brian compared the dogfight to the development. And then they have a recapitulation where they come back many times in the home key, and I was knocked out that Brian knew that Sousa, this wasn't by accident. He was copying these things. And that forever changed my just viewpoint on what symphonies were, and the complexity and the brilliance of John Philip Sousa and Henry Fillmore and Carl King and all these great pieces of literature that we have. So thanks again, Dr. Daughters. You can tell everybody here, if given the opportunity, this could have been the 20 hours of our 10 sessions, probably on its own. And Jim would be getting warmed up. You can tell his passion for this, and it's an amazing resource for us on a daily basis at Tech. We're excited to get to share it a little bit. Those handouts are there on the page. I know Jay Daughters at atu.edu. He's always there if you have questions. This is a great person to have come out to your rehearsals, by the way, too, down the line, while we all try to get better at playing marches, not because we have to, but because they're great pieces of music and they're fun. If done right, even the horn players, they like to complain, but they like playing them too. And bands like playing them, audiences like listening to them. And you know what? That's an important thing. So any questions before we maybe just take a few minutes to stretch legs or get a cup of coffee before we turn it over to Dr. Daughters, or Dr. Perry, excuse me?
Any questions at all, guys? Dr. B, you're right, by the way. Sousa started writing in Sonata Allegro, and that's where the march form came from. Yep. Absolutely, 100%. And guys, I'm always free for email. Happy to come out and work on a march with you. If you don't want to ask a question here, I'm more than happy to do that. I love doing it. So thank you all so much for the opportunity.
I have a question. So let's see, Ralph has a question here. He says, a question about changing tempo. So Ralph Brody, is that you? I think you can unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Hi, guys. Dr. Daughters, a march I like to do with junior high bands is the Heritage of the March series version of Circus Days.
Uh-huh.
And it is marked in the tempo gallop or march. And one of the things that the mommies and daddies seem to enjoy is the second time through the trio at 56 to kick it up to the gallop tempo, to play at 120. And you said earlier that Fillmore and Sousa didn't like to change tempos often or at all in their marches. Should I quit doing that?
No, and actually, let me qualify that statement. Both King and Fillmore were showmen big time, both circus guys. And a lot of time when I listen to live performances of them, they will crank it up at the end. As a general rule, though, specifically, just kind of as a blanket statement, don't change tempo. But those circus marches, Henry Fillmore, for example, would throw mallets, bass drum mallets up in the air. So people thought they were cool and, he had big crash cymbal routines of just showy stuff. And they would crank it up at the end. And by all means, and I've done that march and I think I did the same thing. I think I really pushed it at the end for sure. And we do that with the Circus Bee and Rolling Thunder of Fillmore's. We'll push it at the end. So yeah, by all means, it's entertainment, 100%. Circus.
The recently deceased conductor at Stetson University, Bobby Adams, played under Fillmore when Fillmore came to Florida near the end of his life. And he did Rolling Thunder once at a Florida Bandmasters. And he said this was the way, they called him Uncle Henry. They all called him Uncle Henry. This is the way Uncle Henry did it. And right before the final push to the end of that march, the whole thing stopped and the harpist played glissandi for a few seconds just to wind the whole thing up like you were pulling it back on a pinball machine and fire it to the end. So that's a great question, Ralph. I'm really glad you asked it. And it sort of highlights the difference too between a march that was written with one intention as opposed to a march that was written with another. We wouldn't do that necessarily with the Washington Post.
Yeah.
It wouldn't occur to you. I know you that, Ralph. It wouldn't occur to you to do that with the Washington Post like it would with Circus Bee or Rolling Thunder, for example.
Ralph, the other thing I would say with those circus marches, like Henry Fillmore, for example, always wore this complete white suit, but always had on red suspenders. And there were even pictures that I've seen that he had on red polka dot boxers. So when he would take his coat off, all you would see was the suspenders and the polka dots. I say that to say he was a comedian big time and loved to just ham stuff up during performances. So for example, using the harp as glissandi and stuff, he would do stuff like that all the time. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think for me, the blanket statement in general, if I'm telling anyone, don't change the tempo more for military marches than anything, but circus marches, that's 100% entertainment.
Thanks.
Half the time, Fillmore had that dog sitting next to the podium on the stage, Mike the radio hound,
Yep.
to keep everybody entertained. We have a question in the chat, Dr. Daughters. When you mention resting brass during various strains, does that include the horns, and or what are appropriate ways to rest the horns?
They would like it to include the horns. No, the heart of the march, if the heart of the march it's absolutely essential that it stays there. If you take the horns out, a lot of times the horns are in 3-4 part harmony. It's the harmonic language, including the bass line underneath of the melody and counter melody. Now, you can take the percussion out, for example, that is that heart, but I would not rest the horns. Horns, unfortunately, being that absolute essential element, there's not a great time for them to rest, quite frankly. They have to be there. And it's just one of those things that you've got to plow through and make sure they're accurate. It's the harmonic language of that when they're playing those chord upbeats that is really, really important. Brass rests more, take them out of a first strain or a second strain and let the woodwind shine, but the horns have to be there.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you all.